Hello and welcome back to another video where this one will be covering all the changes that happened in January throughout January 2024. And we start out with every section of the front line, the territorial changes that has happened and the current situation. So we start out in the direction of Kinky, where the developments here are very small and few. There are only two developments that happened on the 14th and 17th of January, and despite the Ukrainians only holding on to such a small area, the Russians still have not fully pushed out the Ukrainians. The Russians argue that this is to keep the Ukrainians putting more and more troops into this area and grind down the Ukrainian soldiers at the section of the front as they continue to send more and more troops despite the unfavorable situation and circumstances around their bridgehead across. And the Ukrainians say that this is still salvable. They still are able to create a bridgehead here in Kinky despite the little area that they hold and being continuously pushed back. And some even argue that the Russians are taking a lot of losses trying to push the Ukrainians back despite the Ukrainian lack of supplies here across the river line. Then we move on to the Zaporizhzhia front here, specifically by Robotine, where again there's only been a few advancements. The Russians made a very small advancement here in the direction of Verbove. They do have control over all of the trenches here in the Verbove direction. Therefore, they do not really have an interest in moving further, except if they are able to cut off a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. But the Ukrainians likely only have small assault groups across the first line of defenses, the anti-tank ditch and so on. So there's no interest in the Russians pushing them across. They simply want to continue the stalemate and continue the war of attrition. More importantly, it's the direction towards Robotine, where there is a lot of positional fighting, where both the Ukrainians and the Russians are trying to make some small advancements. The Russians to the southwest and south of Robotine, and the Ukrainians to the northwest. They're trying to flank any possible Russian advancements and try to gain control over the trenches that lay here to the west of Robotine. Gaining full control of them would solidify the control over Robotine, even though there's a lot of Russian pressure to the south. This is why there's a lot of back and forth in this section. So the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack in the northwest, and the Russians are trying to counterattack the south of Robotine. Both are fighting over the village, because if the Ukrainians lose the village, then they'll likely be forced to withdraw from this salient and back until the starting point. Now, the southwestern parts of the front line are clearly not the highlights, but we move on to the Pervomaiske direction, where at the end of last month, on the 29th and 31st of January, we saw some Russian advancements after an armored column went up to this forest patch area, and they started fighting over the forest patch, and as such we saw a start of a possible Russian offensive operation trying to gain control over this river line here to the north of Pervomaiske, securing their positions here, allowing them to protect their flank in case they want to launch an offensive towards Novomykhailivka, because any such offensive towards Novomykhailivka would be very risky if they do not have their flanks covered, as the Ukrainians could just launch a counterattack and cut them off. So we're seeing that there is some efforts there. We also saw in the month of January both a Russian advance that took a foothold here in the forest lines, followed by a quick Ukrainian counterattack that ended that Russian advance within 24 hours, and as such we have seen no other movement in this direction. It shows that the Ukrainians are very strong and holding onto these positions very heavily in this section of the front, and as such the Russians have a very hard time trying to counterattack in this section, and therefore will likely see a continuous stalemate. And this is why they switched their efforts and attention towards Pervomaiske, where they have had much more success. We then move on to one of the highlights in the month of January, and that is the Novomykhailivka direction, where we are seeing Russian forces attacking both the northern and southern flanks of Novomykhailivka. The southern flank is more towards the road that goes between Marinka and Uledar, here to the west of Novomykhailivka, and the northern flank is directly towards Novomykhailivka to try and expand the front that the fighting is taking place at. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have counterattacked in the southern flank to prevent the Russians from making too many advances here towards the road between Pobeda and Uledar, as that is one of the main supply routes into Uledar. And at the same time, we've also seen the Ukrainians launching a counterattack within the town itself of Novomykhailivka, kicking the Russians out of the town and as such securing it so far. So we're seeing that there is a constant effort by the Russians to gain a foothold within Novomykhailivka and to expand the fighting here in this section of the front, as the Russians wish to push the front line in a western direction towards Konstantinivka, and with that cutting off the supply lines here between the north and the south. Rather than between Marinka and Pobieda, it is now more correctly to say that it goes through the western parts towards Konstantinivka and then down south to Uledar. This is because with the Russian control over Marinka, this highway that goes here through the south of Marinka is no longer in use by the Ukrainians to supply the southern parts of this front. We'll likely see that the majority of the supplies go through Velika Novosilka and then up to the central parts, and from the Pokrovsk direction here in a southern direction towards the central parts, and before moving into these smaller roads towards Konstantinivka and then down to Ledar. So Konstantinivka is one of the main supply hubs for this section of the front line, not just for Uledar, but this whole section, and as such it is one of the targets for the Russians, and this is also why it is heavily defended by the Ukrainians, where they have multiple units here at the front line and also multiple in reserve to deal with any of the Russian assaults. A bit further north in the same section of the front line, the Russians have made some small advancements here in the Horlivka and Marinka direction, where there's been continuous fighting here towards Horlivka, and the Russians have made these small advancements both to the north of the industrial area as well as the outskirts of Horlivka. This happened following the Russian capture of Marinka in December, and there's just been some small assault groups and positional fighting west of Marinka with no big offensive operations. Moving on towards Pervomaiske, we have seen significant changes here, and this all happened with a Russian flanking maneuver where an assault group launched an attack towards the northern parts. Seeing this as a threat to their positions, the Ukrainians withdrew from the central parts to reinforce the northern parts, and following that withdrawal, the Russians moved in and made several advancements over the next couple of days and weeks until the end of January, where they managed to capture most of the central parts of Pervomaiske, leaving only the northern parts in Ukrainian control and the front line moving a bit further up. So with this, we see that the Russians are trying to pick up the pace of the central parts here towards Pervomaiske after a lot of success in the northern parts, leading to nothing more than them holding this northern flank and putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian positions, but not really changing the nature of the situations. The Russians need full control over Pervomaiske to limit the supply going through the southern flank of Avdiivka, and for this they need to move further in the central parts, and this is why we saw a lot of action there. We also saw some small advancements by the Russians towards Nevelske. However, they are still far from the village, and therefore it is difficult for them to call this any significant success or advancements, but there is still some nonetheless through the months of January. We then move on to the next highlight of January, and that is Avdiivka. The main points of the month of January for Avdiivka were starting out with these counterattacks here on the flanks on the 8th, 5th, and 9th of January, where the Ukrainians made some small counterattacks and recaptured some smaller positions in the different areas where the Russians have attempted offensive operations. And with these counterattacks in the northern flank, the Ukrainians stabilized the front line after continuous Russian advancements. We also saw one here in the southern parts towards Siversk, which ended any Russian attempts towards the village of Siversk and Tanenke as they were pushed back out of the area. So with this, we saw that the Russians moved their focus from the flanks, which hardly saw any movement, just a small advance here by Sepova to the north of that throughout the whole month of January, and into the central parts of Avdiivka, where we not only saw the capture of the military base here to the southwest of Avdiivka towards the end of the month, but we also saw a massive breakthrough in the southern outskirts of the city and into the residential area here towards the middle, towards the end of January. This all took place due to one of the pipelines that were found by the Russians that entered from the outskirts of the Dacia area to the southeast of Avdiivka and all the way to Sarka Ohota, which was an important stronghold of the Ukrainians at a point in the middle of everything. And after locating that pipeline and using it to transfer hundreds of soldiers, the Russians then managed to gain a foothold in the residential area and ended up capturing the whole fortifications to the south of Avdiivka and getting a proper foothold within the residential area. However, since all of this took place without a lot of fighting, as the Russians simply took the Ukrainians off guard, the Ukrainians ended up losing a lot of men taken prisoner, and they started counterattacking towards all of these positions to try and put the Russians off balance after their capture. But the Russians, rather than being greedy and advancing further and attacking in all directions, they instead focused on holding their positions and solidifying their control over them, which is why we have seen the Ukrainians struggle to push the Russians out. And after weeks of fighting since then, or approximately a week of fighting since then, the Russians are still holding on to these positions, but there's been no efforts by them to advance further. There's been some small attacks here to the southwest of the military area where they managed to make these small advancements, but that is again just to solidify their control. We'll most likely see some further operations by the Russians moving forward, trying to capture the important areas here in the nearby residential area and to solidify the control in southern Avdiivka. But other than that, we'll likely see no bigger offensive operations towards any of the major parts of Avdiivka. At least not until that they have probably solidified their control and have sent enough reinforcements in to continue their operations, because at the moment they are just barely holding on with all of the fighting that is taking place and the additional Ukrainian reinforcements arriving to this part of the front line, trying to push them out. We've also seen some Russian advances to the southeast of the forest area, where they started pushing into and getting a foothold within it, capturing Ukrainian fortifications and now having a foothold within the forest area. So we'll likely see a lot of infantry on infantry fighting within the forest area, as the Russians will try to move forward and solidify their control here in the southern Avdiivka. This will likely be the eastern Bakhmut of the Avdiivka battle. As for the northern parts of Avdiivka, we also saw several advancements by the Russians, both at the start of the month, but also in the middle and towards the end of it, where the Russians managed to get a foothold in multiple dacha areas, both here in the northern parts and in the eastern parts of Avdiivka. They also managed to make some advancements in the field, trying to gain proper positions and expanding their control. All of this in an attempt to grind down the Ukrainian forces and spread them around from the southern parts. Because as we can see here, the main advancements that took place was this one here to the southwest of Kremmina, and this happened just at the same time as the fighting took place here in the south. So this was to cause panic with the Ukrainians and trying to spread out the reinforcements arriving towards the city to prevent the Ukrainians from kicking out the Russians to the south by making a lot of pressure in the north. And at the same time, they had an interest in advancing here in the north to cut off the Ukrainian defenders here to the east, which have been surviving for a long time due to the heavy fortifications. For example, this fortified area here to the northern parts of it that goes around in a circle, defending it from all sides. The only solution to that for the Russians is to cut it off from supplies completely, allowing them to starve them out. And as such, they need to advance here to the west of Kupiansk to try and cut off their supply lines. So there are some interest in them taking it and control and advancing in these positions to grind down the Ukrainian forces in the area and gain better control of it. So we're going to see a lot more fighting in the Avdiivka directions, because the Russians will likely not stop until they have full control over the city, just like Bakhmut. Bakhmut was a battle that landed for a long time. It lasted for a long time, and the Russians kept pushing, or the Wagner soldiers mainly kept pushing all the way from January until May, and we'll likely see the same in Avdiivka. They'll continue fighting until they take full control over the city, and they'll likely try to use it as a bait for Ukrainian elite units to get into the city to try and hold back the Russians, and the Russians will try to destroy them in the city, trapping them in a fight rather than the Ukrainian elite soldiers moving around the front line, only being and appearing whenever the Russians have been weakened. Moving further north, the next point is here in the direction of Horlivka, where towards the end of the month, on the 30th of January, the Ukrainians managed to take control over these fortifications the Russians have held on to since 2014, and as such it spells a new offensive operations by the Ukrainians, where they'll likely try to do the same as they did here in the northern parts by the hills and other areas that are defensive positions by the Russians, likely to do continuous probing attacks by the Ukrainians to see if there's any weak points in Horlivka for a potential further offensive in the future. And this is one of the points that I mentioned. The area here between Horlivka and Donetsk, here in central Donetsk, would be an important point for any Ukrainian offensive operations if they want to put a lot of pressure on the Russians, because the Russian supply lines here, although that there are several connections, they all go very close to the front line. Therefore, having a large concentration of forces in the Donetsk region is difficult for the Russians, because they would be very vulnerable to Ukrainian airstrikes and artillery strikes or long-range MLRS strikes that could hit them in the back line. And this is something the Ukrainians are aware of, and therefore they try to keep the fighting in the Donetsk region. Moving further north in the Bakhmut direction, there's been a lot of fighting here, but hardly any movements, especially compared to the December time, where the Russians made a lot of advancements in the northern flank, and in this month the Russians didn't make a single advancement in the northern flank. They instead were pushed back in multiple parts here in Bogdanivka, as well as to the southeast of that, and to the southeast of that yet again, as the Ukrainians stabilized the front and are preventing further Russian advancements. At the same time, the southern flank, we've seen multiple Russian advancements, most importantly here to the north of Klishchivka, where the Russians are here attempting to expand and solidify their control over the fortification north of Klishchivka by getting control over this forest patch, and then subsequently likely going to move further westwards and northwards towards Siversk if they want to reach the canal line and cut off the Ukrainian forces in the south. But then again, here in the southern direction, it is similar to the Robotine direction, where a lot of the Ukrainian forces here to the south are likely just smaller assault groups, as the Ukrainians do not have an interest in concentrating a large amount of soldiers at the front line, and therefore the Russians are just hitting them with artillery non-stop, and the Ukrainians send more and more forces in to try and pressure the Russian positions and counterattack to try and cut off any of their advancements. So the Russians are trying to move slowly to try and get a solid control over areas to prevent Ukrainian counterattacks from succeeding, and slowly advancing by heavily bombarding any of the Ukrainian positions in the area. Moving further north in the Siversk front, we saw the Russian capture of Vesele, which in and of itself doesn't really spell that much significance, as the Ukrainian positions here in Siversk are very strong, but the main part or point of it is a Russian capture of a Ukrainian village here in 2024, which is there's only a few of them so far, and at the same time in the Siversk front, where no village has fallen for a very long time, although fighting has taken place over Svirne for a long time, there's been no Russian capture of it. And with the capture of Vesele, it shows that the Russians still are capable of capturing anything, really, as long as they put their efforts into doing so. But most importantly, it shows that the Ukrainian positions all throughout the front are being pressured. The same with Horlivka, although there's been only a few small advancements that can hardly be called much of significance at all. They still managed to make these advancements, which shows that the Ukrainians are being pressured here as well. As for the Kremmina front, this has been yet another highlight. Although yet again it dwarfs in comparison to December, the Russians have managed to make several advancements towards the villages of Terny and Horlivka. They've also made advancements here in the Siversk forest area, and they have a net income in terms of territory controlled. The Ukrainians tried counterattacking and managed to succeed for a very long time, but the Russians recently negated that by recapturing some of the territories they had before, but the Ukrainians managed to resecure in a counterattack. And with this, pressure towards Terny and Horlivka increases, and the Russians are trying to essentially gain control over this area so that they're able to start a battle over the villages by the Serebets River, and their goal is likely to get full control over the Serebets River, and therefore we're seeing a lot of fighting, mostly positional, but this is likely going to escalate as the Russians advance further and further towards the river line. Finally, there is the area here west or northwest of Svatove, east of Kupiansk, where we've seen a lot of Russian advancements towards Tabaivka, capturing the village, as well as the village of Hochmelne, and now fighting towards Berestove and Piszane. Here in this section of the front, the Russians have been attacking Kislivka and Kotlyarivka for a very long time, but they never really succeeded in getting a foothold and starting an attack towards both of them. They instead did a lot of positional fighting and artillery battles between the two. There's been a lot of back and forth north of these villages, where the Ukrainians and the Russians constantly fight over the areas here to the south of Pershutravneve, which in the end didn't do much but just exchange of hands of open fields. But in the direction of the south, after the capture of Novomykhailivka, the Russians thought they would be able to move here towards the Zaporizhzhia area and pressure Berestova from the south. However, the Ukrainian defenses here by Berestova have been very solid, and as such the Russians have been unable to advance in that section, and then the Ukrainians instead continuously launch counterattacks towards Novomykhailivka to the point that they are at the very outskirts of the village yet again, and the Russians are only holding on to the village because the Ukrainians simply have been too occupied defending other areas. As such, the Russians decided that they would need to pressure Berestova from a different direction, and with continuous advancements towards Horlivka, capturing the village, and subsequently launching attacks in multiple directions after that, they've managed to pressure the Berestova direction from multiple directions, and most importantly, they've managed to advance further northwards by the highway and capturing Zaporizhzhia as well as the heights to the west of it and the fortifications thereof. So with all of these advancements, the Russians now have solid control over Zaporizhzhia and Horlivka, and as such we'll likely see further operations by the Russians towards Piszczany and Berestova, as well as towards Horlivka from the south. With this, the Russians now have operational encirclement over Horlivka and have increased their pressure towards Kislivka, and we'll likely see a lot of more fighting taking place in the Kupiansk front over the next period of time, as the Russians will continue trying to gain proper control over the area and pressure the Ukrainians. And there's also been this small advancements by the Russians towards Sinkivka after continuous attempts by the Russians to gain a foothold within the village or control of it after capturing it, but they've never been managing to gain that successfully. The Russians have been pressuring the Ukrainians a lot in the area, but there's been no significant developments or changes over the past few months. And that is all for the January recap. That is all that happened in the month of January. And let's look forward to the month of February to see what will happen there. And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.